So I want to introduce you to Professor Tazreena Sajjad. She works for the School of International Service at American University, and she is an expert in refugee crises, as is Roy Potts. He is a fellow in Canada right now for the Council on Foreign Relations, and also has a background at DHS. And he will be speaking to us first about his most recent work as well as the situation in Ukraine. Thank you both for being with us.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. I want to thank Anne for inviting me to be here. And I'm going to try and keep my remarks short so that we can allow more time for Professor Sajjad and Q&A, but I hope to contribute to your understanding of this important issue. I just want to point out my remarks are provided in my personal capacity. I'm on leave from USCIS while I complete my fellowship as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow here in Canada. I'm in Montreal. My opinions are expressed here are my own and do not reflect the views of USCIS, DHS, or the US government. I have worked mostly at the intersection of both unclassified and classified intelligence and humanitarian issues. In my position at USCIS, I'm Chief of Research for our Refugee Asylum International Operations Directorate. And there I manage a team of about 8 researchers and support staff. My team delivers a variety of unclassified research products, including reports for the Director of USCIS and the Secretary of Homeland Security. We provide essentially what's referred to as country of origin information, country conditions information, and that information is used to support the adjudications, complex adjudications, by over 1,200 or so refugee officers and asylum officers. My team also prepares a report that is part of the process for determining temporary protected status, which has come up quite a bit recently, but certainly within the last week or so when I believe the Secretary made a decision to extend temporary protected status to Ukrainians living in the United States. So right now, here in Montreal, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the intersection of migration, immigration, race, and national identity. I've spent a number of years, 17 or so years at State Department, and now about 14 years at DHS, sort of in the space of humanitarian protection, human rights. And I wanted to take a step back and come to Montreal, come to Canada, and sort of look at this intersection of migration, race, and national identity, and kind of get a picture of how they see things and where are they with regard to their changing population, and it's changing through immigration and migration. Just a few quick points. Continued violence, poverty, and climate change have led to increased displacement in Central America, and Haiti's always on our radar because of political and social unrest. I wanted to explore these issues because I really do believe that the bilateral relationship between the US and Canada is incredibly important in terms of trying to address some of these issues. I'm right now very concerned about what's going on and what I've been reading about the treatment of Black and Asian refugees fleeing Ukraine. And so I'm watching that situation, seeing what happens there. I don't want to tell you a lot of things that you may already know, but I'll just quickly point out that terms are very important, and the term refugee has very particular meaning, as does asylum within the US context. And I've given Anne a sheet with sources, and I'm sure that will be shared with you, and I'll just quickly go through some of those sources, which I think are really helpful, and you may or may not be aware of them all, but there in that sheet, there are links to population, refugees, and migration, which is a part of DOS. There are links to DHS, the Office of Immigration Statistics. There's a link to the European agency that monitors and gives support to asylum systems across the continent, European continent. And there's a link to the Migration Policy Institute, which I think is one of the best think tanks out there, not for profits out there, sort of following this situation. So you have some helpful links there that you could sort of dive deeper into this subject if you like, and when you need to. I also handed out it's called an asylum flow report. I couldn't find a more current one other than 2019. There should be a 2020 coming out, or maybe it is out, but I couldn't find it. But that provides the sort of a year in review of statistics compiled again by DHS's Office of Immigration Statistics. And then it also gives a really helpful sort of backgrounding on just our asylum policy and past practice. So hopefully you'll have that as well. Quickly, I looked at UNHCR's data portal for the latest numbers on refugees coming out of Ukraine. I looked last night, and that number was, last night it was 1,500,000, and as of this morning, it had jumped up by 200,000 to 1.7 million people displaced in the Ukrainian context. I will also just share with you, here in Canada, Canada has outside of Russia, the largest Ukrainian diaspora. Many Ukrainians came here to Canada to settle and homestead in some of the Western provinces. So they have a very active and large Ukrainian community here, and they've been very forward-leaning and out front on pushing the government to do more here around the situation for Ukrainian refugees. Also wanted to just note again in terms of just understanding this issue that 85% of the world's refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries. So there's an incredible burden that is shouldered by the poor nations around the world in the Southern Hemisphere. But I'm sure and expect the U.S. is going to be playing a very important role in resettling Ukrainian refugees. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Professor Sajjad. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to Professor Sajjad, does anyone have any specific questions for Mr. Potts before we continue? Yes, Suzanne Mognac from CQ Roll Call.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. So I cover immigration, and I would love to hear a little bit more. It's interesting that you've worked in the U.S. and are now based in Canada. What are your thoughts on sort of the asylum sharing obligations between the U.S. and Canada? I understand that treaty was challenged, I think it was last year, but was ultimately upheld. Could you see the U.S. and Canada sort of revising that? Do you think that's due for an update given this situation? And sort of what are your thoughts on how Canada's approached this Ukrainian crisis compared to how the U.S. has from an immigration standpoint?
It's really interesting to get the first question from CQ because my very first job was working for CQ Quarterly. So it's a pleasure to get this question from you. I really can't make any pronouncements on what the U.S. and Canada will do with regard to their agreement. I assume you're referring to the Safe Third Country Agreement?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just know it's an important issue. It's an issue of a lot of discussion between the two countries, and there's certainly interest in taking a look at it again. In terms of coordination, is that what was also part of the question?
Yeah, like ways that they could coordinate given the country's like prior history in coordinating on this issue, but also just sort of how Canada is differing from the U.S. on this. Canada's maybe a little more immigration friendly than the U.S. is, but kind of depends who you ask. I was just curious, like how you could see the two countries either coordinating or responding differently.
I think they'll definitely be talking to each other on this, and as I mentioned, Canada has the second largest Ukrainian diaspora, and the Ukrainian community has been very active on this issue so far. Prime Minister Trudeau has made a number of pronouncements already in terms of his willingness to want to assist, and so I think they're going to be very forward-leaning in terms of welcoming, bringing in Ukrainian refugees.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I guess just looking ahead, we know that this is sort of an unprecedented number of refugees in Europe. I think the comparison is always made to World War II. I'm just curious, given your expertise, what we're going to see over the next couple of weeks and months. Obviously, at some point, Ukraine will need to be rebuilt before people can, return home if they even want to. What is your sense of where this sort of goes next and how this is going to look? And is that similar to other regional refugee patterns and migration patterns, or is this going to be like a totally different animal from anything we've seen in recent history?
Well, I'm surprised and heartened by the response, particularly European nations. Again, I was on their platforms last night looking at just the enormous and varied responses. It's coming fast and furious in terms of the different countries and the offerings, I'll say, in terms of what they're willing to do and want to do for the Ukrainians. It's impressive, and but I think in some regard we're all going to be playing catch up. Again, the numbers are astounding. Again, this one-day jump of 200,000 is significant, and I'm sure that's an undercount. And so I think there's going to be a lot of effort to catch up to this number, to these numbers that are just, increasing exponentially by the day.
Thank you. Professor Sajjad, would you like to start with your presentation?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to this event. Some of my work reflects on refugee reception, border violence, race, and identity in the context of quote-unquote refugee crises. And it's a pleasure to share the platform with Mr. Potts, who has talked about a few of the issues that I want to get into today in light of my work. I want today's audience to reflect on a few questions before I show a few pictures. And then I have just a couple of points for everybody to reflect on in this room, because if anything, the refugee crisis pertaining to Ukraine has, in my analysis, cemented, exposed, and showed consistency in the way different refugee communities are covered in terms of media, but also received in particularly when it comes to countries of the global north. So without much further ado, let me just ask you all to think through a few of the questions, because even if you are doing work in print media, particularly doing writing, images are part and package of the knowledge through which we understand what we mean by a refugee or a displaced person. So the first question I would ask you to all think about is, what role do visual images have in the construction of our concept of the refugee? Because we are, largely speaking, very visual in terms of our understanding of a particular situation, of a particular context, of any people. And so visual images become part of the narrative and become part of shaping that story and become part of reflecting our assumptions as well. The second is, what do the photos of refugees tell us about their subject and their audience? Why are some instances of forced migration covered extensively by the media while others are ignored? There are very important reasons as to why there is so much focus on Ukraine, and there certainly should be. But at the same time, we have some crises going on in other parts of the world, including, of course, Afghanistan, including, of course, Tigray, which did not necessarily either get as much attention, or it has fallen off in terms of our attention, particularly in the global north, in talking about refugee crises. Another question is, what determines the type of media treatment that refugees receive? It's a question of, again, a lot of need for reflection and soul searching in terms of what gets covered, what is assumed in terms of the audience reception to the news and audience need for information, and what therefore does not get covered, or how an issue gets covered based on specific language and media images that are used. What moves people to respond to visual images as well as narratives of forced migration, and how does terminology impact the way we quote unquote see and understand the displacement crisis? So these are the questions I certainly ask my students to think about when we talk about refugees, refugee crisis, and displacement crisis. And these are questions I would ask today's audience to reflect on. Let me just go through a quick couple of images, because there are a couple of things I just want to raise. Some of these images, they're not out of Ukraine. There are valid reasons as to why I have chosen them, but they have been part and package of our narrative around refugee and displacement crisis, particularly in the last several years. And you will see that there is, in these three images, for instance, we see a particular framing of and a particular narration that we are trying to talk about in terms of gender, in terms of the role of motherhood, in terms of the images of victimhood, hopelessness, and helplessness. And in that way, there is a stock photo, if you will, particularly when we think about refugee crises coming out of, for instance, in the last several years, certainly the Middle East, but also in the context of North Africa or Asia. And certainly in some instances with regard to Central America. So that particular question of why we gravitate towards this pictures of mothers and children, where the mother and children becomes, basically one word, people captured in time, people captured at very agonizing moments of their lives, without full agency of who's taking the picture, how their pictures and how their stories are going to be narrated, and how these pictures are going to be part of framing the political discourse in terms of the audiences around the world who's going to be consuming the pictures and formulating their own ideas and perceptions about refugees. This particular image is really important because it is one of the most famous images that came out of Syria in the early days of the Syrian crisis, particularly when that crisis came to the doors of Europe. The crisis had been unfolding for a long period of time, but it seemed, quote unquote, very far away and not the problem of what is called the West until really 2014 and largely speaking 2015. And here again, the question of gender becomes really important, because what we are really trying to focus on is the fact that the image of a man, particularly a man from the global south, who is generally portrayed as quote unquote a criminal, a quote unquote a terrorist, quote unquote, a problematic individual or an economic migrant suddenly looks different if they're portrayed with their children. And so their different version of humanity can be represented, and the masculine image that is associated with the threat becomes much more mollified if you are presenting that individual in relationship with their children, which means that the relational aspect of the refugee becomes very important in terms of being able to tell a story. And this is a strange term that we use, but that is used consistently, which is humanizing the refugee. The refugee, by definition, is already human, but for some reason, we go through processes of dehumanizing human beings, and then we have to go through the process of rehumanizing human beings, and images are a very important part of that particular process. The other thing that we see a lot, particularly when it comes to migration movements from the so-called global south, are pictures of quote unquote masses. That is very much ties into also stories that are told and the way news reporting happens around major situations of displacement, whether we are talking about, for instance, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, certainly Guatemala, in the case of Afghanistan, in the case of Syria, in the case of Iraq. And in these images, what happens is the individuality of people are lost. In a way that we see these numbers, and it sort of already frames for us a situation of an emergency where the fundamental takeaway is this receiving state is losing control. And when we see these images, particularly framed in terms of men of certain ages, then the trope of the threat that emanates from the refugee, the migrant, becomes even more pronounced. And we see this time and again in terms of media coverage. And I think it's something for us to reflect on in terms of what story do images also tell us before we even get to the actual stories that are written in words with regard to coverage of different crises. This is another image, of course, where the individuality of a situation and the individuality of the people who are obviously at the center of the story is lost when we are seeing only bodies and numbers, and they're all disposable in a way, but also replaceable, and they're interchangeable. And I think that is also something for us to consider in terms of coverage. When news reporting is very effective, it is when a deep dive is taken into a particular story, whether it is in terms of covering the complex drivers of conflict. By the way, one thing I would say is there's a lot of conversation nowadays about the climate crisis driving international migration, where scholarship would actually refute that to a great extent, because climate crisis, first of all, is not a natural disaster. Second of all, it happens in conjunction with other kinds of crises, political, social, economic. And third, a lot of people displaced by climate crisis moves actually within and inside a country. They don't necessarily spill across international borders. And so again, when we talk about a situation of displacement, words and terminology, and this is something Mr. Potts already raised, becomes extremely important, because we are obviously signaling to our audience what is the understanding of a particular situation we want to walk away with. So when news reporting is highly investigative and in-depth in terms of being able to cover contexts, the political contexts, multiple stories of movement of an individual from point A to point B, really highlighting the stories of their struggles in terms of the social, political, economic, cultural obstacles they face, together with how they navigate that, then print media has been absolutely phenomenal. But one of the things that we actually come across are this kind of imaging followed by, and here is where I will start wrapping up, is a certain narrative that has become very problematic and I would say deeply dangerous to the conversation about refugees and migration. The first I would say is how do we understand the term refugee? Mr. Potts already referred to this in terms of, the refugee has a very specific definition in terms of international law. Asylum seekers have a very specific relationship in that conversation about international law. And then, of course, migrants. And while the term migrant is a catch-all phrase, whenever the term migrant is normally used, is associated with economic issues. And so the immediate understanding we have of the economic migrant is that he, she, they are not protected and cannot be protected by any systems or mechanisms that exist in terms of their right to life and dignity. The second thing I want to point out is that when we have these images, there's a story we know that is already being told, and that is then covered in terms of language. And that is, of course, that images of quote unquote angry young men, images of frustrated refugees, are very much tied into the broader way language is used in the context of coverage of displacement, which is there's a lot of coverage when we say, for instance, when we use the term influx, when we use the term swarms, which is actually a term that is used for insects and should not be used for human beings. There are terms such as invasion or storming, which are highly militarized terms, and immediately there's a certain understanding that is produced that, again, the receiving state is losing control. The receiving state has absolutely no way of responding, and there is aggression associated with those who are obviously trying to cross a border they could not cross through legal channels. Another term that is used is flood, again, associated with a natural disaster, but also implying that there is a complete lack of control and there's a complete absence of any form of management or possibility of management when we are talking about larger numbers of arrivals. And finally, I do want to also reflect on the way coverage has been done with regard to Ukraine versus other contexts. Mr. Potts had referred to the question of African and Asian refugees. I would argue, in fact, let me just let you know that I produced a very short piece on Ink and Stick Media called Refugees, Welcome Refugees from Ukraine and Everywhere. I urge all of you to take a look at it. And on the and in the conversation, I'll have another piece out very shortly, either today or tomorrow, or early next week, or early this week, really, on the question of race and the coverage of Ukrainian refugees. The treatment that we are seeing of Asian and African students, Asian and African residents, as Ukrainian refugees are rightly frightened and obviously in danger and fleeing Ukraine, I would argue is consistent with the way Europe has treated other refugee and asylum groups in the past. And we don't have to go very far back in history. Even the coverage in terms of major newspapers calling previous refugees from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, calling them migrants. But in the case of Ukraine, immediately resorting to the use of the term refugee signals already in terms of who has legitimacy and who does not. And certainly in terms of, it is gratifying and wonderful to see how European countries are responding, how Canada is thinking of responding, and how the United States is responding. But there's a hierarchy that is also being signaled to the international community in terms of whose lives are worth saving, whose lives are disposable, who have legitimate claims to protection and who does not. And that's a really, really dangerous place we are in right now in terms of playing politics with people's lives. Because according to international laws that exist, race, color, creed, country of origin, religion, sexual orientation, and gender have no role to play in terms of an individual's right to life. But when we are being very careful and selective of the terms we use to talk about what is a situation that requires and demands our empathy and what doesn't, then we then we are already actually using very problematic and biased filters to understand what is happening in every context. Last point I want to make is, when do we use the term crisis? How do we use it? Under what conditions do we use it? And what does it mean to use the word crisis in some situations as opposed to others? Crisis of what and crisis for whom? There is obviously something to be said about use of the term crisis in any situation, in terms of diluting a situation or overusing the term. But in the case of Europe, because it is dealing with and facing the situation in Ukraine right now, the term crisis that was used from 2015 onwards was to signify that Europe was under quote unquote siege, that Europe had lost complete control in terms of having to deal with the arrival of 1.5 million refugees and asylum seekers. And it's very problematic to assume that Europe has never handled refugee crises before. Europe is actually in some way, shape, or form very well versed as a continent deal with multiple wars and multiple crises. And so we have to be very careful about terms like unprecedented and crisis, and ask ourselves, why do we use these terms in certain contexts, and why do we refuse to use it in others? What does crisis signify in this situation? And who do we forget when we legitimize empathy for some groups, but at the same time refuse to acknowledge the humanity in others? I'll just end here, and I'm open to any questions that you may have.
I wanted to go back to a point you made, because it's something that I think that we as journalists encounter actually in a number of different areas, which is if you focus in a lot on the individual, you may tell a very compelling story, but you lose some of the perhaps systemic and more complex context. Whereas if you focus on the 1.7 million, again, you run into the issue of it becomes just a number and you miss out. Other than blending those two, do you have any suggestions or things that you see work particularly well, and how journalists should be thinking about that from an ethical perspective?
That's a great question, and I think it's very hard for us to imagine what 1.7 million looks like. And I think when we start throwing out numbers of that, numbers that are that huge, then it is possible to dismiss the fact that each of these numbers are representative of a human life. But at the same time, I think consistency is important in terms of being able to highlight the complexities. I mean, if you talk about Ukraine is the home to many different groups of people. There are Jewish Ukrainians, there are Muslim Ukrainians, there are Ukrainians of different backgrounds. And so it's important to highlight the distinctions, and it's important to highlight the variegated ways in which they are having to navigate the complexities of this political situation and this level of military incursion. But it is possible to tie it in to the bigger story. And so, having just one story trying to capture everything, or having one story which doesn't connect to the broader context, is where I think that we run into problems. So I would just say, trying to find the space to be able to tell multiple stories so that people have, the audience has a deeper appreciation for complexity rather than simplifying things and looking at it only through one lens. I would suggest, long form stories, and obviously ones that capture different angles and dimensions would be a good way to go, along with being highly selective of the terms and images that are being used to describe the situation.
Thank you. And I'm going to open it up to our fellows, and for those who aren't in the front row, I will relay your questions just so the speakers can hear. Yes.
Kurt Bader, National Journal. Obviously deep dives are the best for any type of topic, especially one as complex as this. But sometimes we're on a daily deadline, and I have a certain economy of space and time that I'm working with. How best should I use that space and time to capture some of the nuances, even if I can't do a 2,000, 3,000 word deep dive in print?
I understand, and I'm actually empathetic, hard as it might be to believe, just because, I live in a world where we have to write very long, convoluted sort of arguments. And I know in the world of journalism, it has to be very short. I think it's just important. I mean, I appreciate the deadline considerations, and I appreciate the fact that you don't have much space to be able to tell a story in very specific ways, but you have some control over the use of language. And so I think that's where some of the focus needs to go, because, in the last several years in particular, I mean, especially in the coverage of the Ukrainian crisis, and I don't necessarily need to point that out, there has been such fantastic journalism over the years about displacement, and yet the implicit as well as explicit biases, and I wouldn't even call them biases, outright racism that has really emerged from different kinds of highly established, media outlets, together with, of course, politicians, say that there is still much learning to be done. So being judicious about those terms, being judicious about the message that needs to be relayed, and of course, constantly, I know journalists are trained extensively in terms of biases and prejudices and assumptions, but it's a work that is never completely done. So being much more conscious of it would be a great start, and then you can tell fantastic stories with very few words, and you still communicate that message. But in a way that is ultimately respectful to the situation and to the people that are being covered in that story.
Thank you. Ashley.
My question is for Mr. Potts. The U.S. ambassador to Moldova is actually from Pittsburgh, so my editors have taken an interest in me keeping in touch with him. And Moldova is a border state to Ukraine with a Russian separatist region. So I'm just wondering if you have been paying attention to this situation in this small country, and if there's any angles that you would advise I explore, as I just keep tabs on the region. And I've done a couple stories on Moldova so far, but I'll probably try to do a couple more.
Apologies, I'm not familiar with the particularities of what's happening there, but I'll pay more attention to it. I can't comment
Thank you.
now. Sorry.
Mark, did you have a question?
Just wondering what sort of aspects of what's taking place in Ukraine with refugees are being undercovered in your opinion, or some things that we should be looking at that are often missed when covering these types of things?
Well, I'd just like to maybe emphasize a point that Tazreena said, and that is getting a variety of voices into the picture. So, one of the things that fascinates me is this narrative around the Black refugees and Asian refugees as being, particularly vulnerable when they are, but they're only talked about in this context of, this particular issue of them trying to get out. And I'd like to see more stories cover a broader cross-section of people. It just seems odd that that's the only time that we're going to see Black or an Asian refugees within this one story. And it's an important story and something I'm really concerned about, but they should be referred to, referenced. Their stories should come up in a variety of places with regard to this context.
I'm just kind of curious, what's the thing that you see pop up in journalism the most that drives you crazy in the way that we cover refugees? Like, what is the number one thing that you want to make sure that we don't make that mistake?
First of all, I just want to say thank you for all of you journalists who are one of the first responders in specific ways in order to cover stories. I mean, you're putting yourselves, your comfort and your lives sometimes on the line to cover stories, and that is deeply appreciated. In my teaching and in my research, I do use a lot of investigative journalism and long-form journalism work, because by the time publications come out, it's way after the fact. And so when you're trying to talk about something, when you're trying to engage students, when you're trying to get immediate information, very well researched pieces thoughtful, complicated pieces are very important. So I really want to acknowledge the fact that that also happens in the print media, and that is a very important part of the story. But I will go back to that in terms of the language that is used to talk about a specific situation, the language that is used to focus on a specific issue, the language that is used in terms of portrayal, is a reflection of society, is a reflection of the needs, aspirations, assumptions, prejudices of society, as well as, of course, confirming biases, as well as creating sites of knowledge. And so, when, in cases where print media as well as visual media, do not live up to that high standard of recognizing that how they are shaping the outcomes of that story, which is people are taking it in, people are weighing the little that they know with how they're being informed, and that is also feeding into, for instance, the way they are looking at a situation and making, sort of shaping their political considerations. I think that is journalism plays such a critical role in that. And so when that part of the site of knowledge is weakened, when that site becomes incomplete, when that site only gives you a little, only sheds a light into only something small, when the complexity is so much, when the diversity is so much, that's where I think there is still work to be done.
Thank you. Mr. Potts, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just the complexity is often missing, and it just, for example, when there is a large population at the southern border trying to seek asylum, it's the writing, the discussion is talked about in very alarmist kind of terms, and this is a situation which has taken probably months, if not years, in the making. In particular, say with the Haitian migrants moving from Brazil and Chile and up, but once they get to the border, it's crazy, and so that really just kind of rubs me wrong that somehow their story was lost between Brazil and the southern U.S. border, and that shouldn't happen. And there's no cure for this, but I wish there was also a better understanding of the mechanics of our immigration system, the day-to-day bureaucracy of it, and the fact that there are people like many of my colleagues who are very hardworking and care deeply, deeply about protection, and somehow they're lost. Their story is lost too. So
one of the things that I noticed, because I have also been studying, Europe, obviously look at, since I one of the things I study is border violence. In 2015 onwards, it was the fundamental assumption that they just came out of nowhere. Like there was, they just popped up suddenly on the shores of Greece, and that's where the story began. Whereas the reality is some of these individuals, many of these individuals, had crossed 10, 15, 17 countries. We spend a lot of time watching reality TV shows, with, where people go on these adventures and jump around from one country to another, with the full knowledge and support of, insurance and cameras and all of that being there. We are talking about individuals who are fleeing with their families, fleeing with injuries, fleeing so many different kinds of horrors, but the amount of mental strength it requires, the amount of innovativeness it requires, the amount of strategizing it requires in order to make those decisions when you have nothing to fall back on, when you know every system and structure is built for deterrence rather than acceptance. It's something, very important for us to ask, and what was that pathway for these individuals? What are their very specific stories? It's the same, and Mr. Potts referred to the Haitian, asylum seekers. I mean, Haitian asylum seekers at the United States borders is a long history. It is tied to a broader question about migration from the Caribbean, including, of course, Haiti. This is nothing new. What obviously was new is that those horribly graphic, inhumane treatment was captured. One of the rare times in history that it was captured. But these are lived realities of people. And so when you talk about asylum seekers at the U.S. southern border, there is so much diversity in that asylum group. I mean, you have indigenous populations who do not speak Spanish. You have from Central American countries. You have people from the DRC who have arrived, and other African countries, particularly because the European routes have been closed. You have South Asians who have arrived. You have Middle Eastern, you have Pakistanis, Afghans, by the way, Middle East, Syrians. So many people have arrived at the U.S. border, but we see only one kind of story because that's the kind of story we are used to consuming, and those are the kinds of images we are used to understanding, and that is a very simplistic portrayal of humanity and human struggles, and I wish there was more of that, that investigation, and a part of me would like to believe that, the more stories you tell people, the more stories they would like to hear. So I think it's one of those situations where, we have to tell that story and move on because there are deadline pressures and all of that. And I'm not a journalist, and I don't obviously function with the constraints that you do. But there may be hunger, or that hunger needs to be created amongst people for these incredible narratives that people hold, complex in so many different ways. And unless we do that, we will be surprised to see someone with a cell phone being called a refugee, which obviously has been problematic with the case of Syrians and Afghans, but in the case of Ukrainians, that has worked in their favor, right? And so we need to be aware of where our assumptions lie about being forcibly displaced. And it is not just obviously people from the so-called, developing countries. It is not just people who look a certain way or come from a certain class or certain background or a certain faith. This can happen to any of us under any set of circumstances. And so being able to capture that complexity, even if we have very short time frame, attention span, and word limit, I think that's where the challenge lies. And I hope that, in the days to come and in the future, we keep rising to that challenge, because this issue is not going to go away anytime soon.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Jimena?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could give a couple more explicit examples of language that you would discourage using. Many of us, for example, don't describe undocumented immigrants as illegal anymore. Politico doesn't use the word crisis anymore. Like, what are other words that you're seeing, especially in this situation, that we should avoid or think twice before using?
I would say, generally speaking, ask yourselves, why are you really focused on using that particular word? When you want to use the word swarm, we say a swarm of locusts. We don't say a swarm of human beings. So, anything that obviously likens a human being to anything that is less than a human being are terms that we would necessarily avoid. Anything that presents a scenario where, where the sense of a crisis is so overwhelming that it creates a panic for no reason. One of my great examples that I use for my students is, for instance, to think about, the fact that if you're going to go back to Europe, because we've been talking about Europe in this context, is how many countries are there in Europe? How many members do we have in the EU? What constitutes a crisis? Why don't we use the term crisis when, for instance, Lebanon has over 1 million refugees? Uganda, which is a small country, has way over 1 million refugees. Bangladesh has, about 1 million refugees. Colombia, Ecuador, I mean, these have taken in huge numbers of people, and yet we don't use the term crisis in those situations. So why do we use the term crisis when it comes to the United States and Europe? Whose crisis are we laying emphasis on? And certainly also paying attention to why do we use terms that we use for non-human beings to describe human beings, when we would not use that. In the Ukrainian crisis, I think generally speaking, and I could be wrong, I mean, I don't obviously speak several of the languages in which the coverage is happening, but it doesn't seem that, some of the language that was used with regard to African and Asian and Middle Eastern refugees and asylum seekers are as much at play. Now, part of it could be there was some learning that happened, or part of it could be there's something that else is going on that requires deeper reflection. So English is a pretty rich language. It has its limitations, but it has a rich language. So I challenge, the journalists, that cover migration issues to look for language that is much more in line with the lived experience of human mobility, rather than having to fall back on insects and animals, to create a certain sense of urgency of the situation.
Thank you. Mr. Potts, any final words?
Just to affirm with what the professor said, I'm someone who has gone to Uganda and interviewed refugees for resettlement in the United States, and countries like Uganda do carry an enormous burden, and that's somehow lost and forgotten. I think they do have probably over 1 million people that they are in refugee camps in Uganda. Really nothing further to add. Just would emphasize and affirm everything that she said, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you all of this.
Thank you both so much for this informative session.